One late winter night, the Skarloey Railway engines were huddling in their shed. The wind was howling outside, and the only thing keeping the engines warm was a Christmas wreath hung on the wall. Said Adeline. Duke smiled. He said, and this was the story. The rescuers stared in amazement. Said one of them enthused. Duke smiled weirdly. It was then that the rescuers noticed something. Duke smiled, but secretly he had his doubts. Some days later, Mr. Hugh came to see Mr. Percival. His office was buried beneath documents and folders. Mr. Percival hadn't heard him come in. He knocked on the door, and a head shot up from behind the desk. And he didn't. News of Duke's discovery travelled fast, and the big engines were excited to see him being restored as they passed the sheds. In spite of the cheerful whistles and greetings, Duke was upset about his tender. One day, he spoke to Gordon. He sighed. Gordon said gravely. Gordon trailed off, seeing the dejected look on Duke's face. But Duke wasn't so sure. That afternoon, Mr. Percival came to the shed with Duke's new crew. The fireman pondered. Mr. Percival sighed. Mr. Percival sighed and stepped out of the shed. Duke and his crew exchanged worried glances. Lost in thought, Mr. Percival stared at the platform. He saw Percy sizzling happily. A small boy stood next to him, proudly holding up a model replica of Percy. He cried in excitement. Duke didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. The months passed and Christmas was approaching. As snow peppered the rails, the little engines found themselves quite busy. Duke's overhaul was complete, but he remained in the shed, a most singular engine. Duke's face fell. Skarloey was more sympathetic. Duke smiled, but still felt he was letting everyone down. But little did he know, a surprise was just around the corner. Dawn broke over the island. Mr. Percival had a spring in his step as he walked towards the works. He flung the door open proudly, and... With a grin, Mr. Percival turned around, and his grin disappeared. He gasped. Outside of the engine shed was a lorry with a long flatbed. Sat on the flatbed, looking shabby and rusted, was a tender. Duke could hardly believe his eyes. Leaning on the lorry was an elderly farmer. Smiled the farmer. Peter Sam was puzzled. It was then that Duke noticed Mr. Percival. Asked Duke. Then he looked towards the work shed and gasped. Sat inside was a tender that looked just like his. Duke was speechless. Duke beamed. Duke pondered. Duke was soon at hard work with the other engines. He was happy to be running again, and his new tender works like a charm. Even Gordon was impressed. Duke was given the honour of taking tourist trains through the hills. The passengers loved riding with him, and the children were always most surprised to see Santa Claus waiting at the lake station. But what about the old tender? It had been restored by the workmen and painted a rich yellow and black to match the holiday season. Duke would be uncoupled at the lake station and fetch it from a siding. It was filled with presents for the children, and Santa Claus would walk up and down the coaches, handing them out to the happy boys and girls. Mr. Percival and the other engines thought it was a wonderful idea. Duke smiled every time he brought it out of the siding. He was glad to give back after receiving the best gifts of all, being found given a new home and having a controller who knew just what an engine needed.